this time, we're going to turn it into the hands of Bishop Tolton and Dr. Kwok, who will guide us through a Q&A. I want to recognize each of our presenters who are on the line with us right now. Reverend Myles, Reverend Adera, Reverend Kakay, so wonderful to have each of you here. Your presentations were absolutely exceptional. I was trying to write notes as fast as I could. It was so much and so rich. My head just wants to I want to have 10 hours with each one of you, but time won't permit. But each of your perspectives was so amazing. I thank you also for the vulnerability that you exposed yourselves to in these sharings. So oftentimes those of us who are in spaces geographically where having these kind of conversations are safe-ish, I want to just acknowledge what it takes to tell the truth where you are. And so we cannot pass this moment and not acknowledge those sacrifices. So I'm going to turn it into the hands of my co-hosts. And Bishop Tolton, I will give it to you and we can just kind of play it from there. We've also asked those who may have some additional questions to just drop those in the chat and we can go from there.
Thank you so much, Bishop Rawls. And I also just want to acknowledge the presence of Professor Pui Lan, and also thank Reverend Kakay and Reverend Myles and Reverend Adera for their wonderful presentations. I am looking in the chat for any particular questions that we might have, but I'm going to start with a question for Reverend Myles. Obviously, all of the presentations were incredibly moving. There was a personal nature to the witness that you expressed and to your presentation. And I was wondering if I could kind of speak to what were your remembrances as you began to explore the scriptures and find some kind of a point of reference that you could self-identify with that became a part of your initial healing?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I know for me that there are a lot of specific passages as well as really salient themes throughout the scriptures that have played a vital role in me being able to be a person who fully affirms LGBTQIA+ people, including myself. And I think when it comes specifically to transgender, gender nonconforming, gender expansive types of experiences, one of the texts that I regularly find myself coming back to is the prophecies in Isaiah that reference the person of the eunuch. And while I don't think there is a direct correlation between the eunuch who's being described in the ancient Near East and contemporary transgender, gender nonconforming people per se, I do think there are shared experiences. I do think that the eunuch, for example, was a person who embodied gender nonconformity. There were things about that person that were true in terms of individual expression, but perhaps even more than that were true of that person socially, communally, the role that they played. And in that particular passage, the writer is describing how traditionally the eunuch is seen as other. So the eunuch is a person who is cast aside, who is marginalized, and yet what the prophecy says is that there will be a day where not only is that person, the eunuch, no longer cut off, no longer should they call themselves a dried up tree, but they are a person who is, frankly, as I interpret it, seen at the center of what it means to belong, what it means to be included. And then we see later Jesus reference that same passage in the Gospel of Matthew. And so that for me is a big one, and one I've spent a lot of time with, felt encouraged by, and love to be able to share with others. And again, I don't think that applies exclusively to transgender, gender nonconforming, gender expansive people, but I, as a person of those experiences, do look at those passages and references as fully affirming and celebratory of our lived experience.
If I could move a little bit, thank you for that. That's beautiful. A little bit away from the micro, which you just spoke to something that's a little bit more macro. Your self-description is as trans masculine, and I think that there's something very powerful about owning it. And I would imagine that it is the ownership of your sense of masculinity versus the perceived idea of the expectation of who you were going to be in terms of your femininity that creates tension for people. But what I'm trying or want to get to is that I think that from a macro perspective, we're living in an interesting day where God's feminine expression of God's self is becoming so very important to the healing of the world. And your ability to own the fullness of yourself, I think, is a reflection of the fact that we are in this age of the divine feminine, where we're all coming to embrace a sense of being comfortable with it. Can you just talk a little bit about the divine feminine and how that has inspired your journey?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it's worth noting here that when it comes to thinking about global rights, affirmation, and dignity for around gender and gender identity, it's not uncommon for there to be something called trans exclusionary radical feminism to be where a lot of the headlines in the media go to. And this is a tactic of groups who wish to vilify, to demonize, and to continue to marginalize trans femme and trans women specifically, but now has also encompassed trans people of different, transgender types of experiences more broadly. And I think it's unfortunately a movement that really takes advantage of the gaps in people's understanding around gender and gender identity, and focuses around, I should rather say it this way, it cloaks itself as something that is for women, for femme people, and for feminism. But one of my most basic responses to that is it was feminism, and so specifically for me, it was Asian American feminist theology that created the space for me to really begin to interrogate gender systems and to look outward globally into how gender is constructed across cultures and has been constructed across time. And so for me, the divine feminine, of the many things that it is a space that frees people up to be honest, to be authentic, to be explorative, to be curious, to be nurturing, to be able to give oneself grace and to give grace toward others. And so for me, I've never felt like I needed to begrudge, dislike, or stigmatize my own femininity. But for me, a lot of that power in identifying as trans masculine is to be able to pull out masculinity in a way where we are interrogating it and understanding that it's not a bad with and of itself. Not all masculinity is toxic masculinity, that there is in fact a way to live out a healthy masculine expression. And in my opinion, that means that it's always living in balance with one's own femininity and femme energy and that sort of thing. So yeah, that it's still the lens for me. The divine feminine and queer feminist thinking is still my approach to understanding masculinity and understanding manhood for all the different things that can mean.
Great. Dr. Kwok.
Amazing.
Yeah, I want to ask this question to both Reverend Godfrey Adera and Ms. Kakay Pamaran. That is, in both of your presentations, you lift up cultural elements, the stories of Babalan or the Ubantu principles. Some of the traditions in Africa or in Asia may counteract a very white heteronormative Christianity, but there are also elements within African or Asian or other indigenous peoples' cultures that we might need to challenge as well. So I would like to ask you to reflect with us how you then have this hermeneutics of suspicion of both those normative ideologies of Christianity and also elements within our own cultures that may be deadening and not allowing bodies to flourish. Can we begin with Reverend Adera?
Thank you so much, Professor, and thank you everyone for this conference. We're grateful as CSC to be part of this. Now, for a very long time, it's Christianity that has provided the text and the language for repression of people who identify as queer. And they're using two basic things. They're using the scripture, and sometimes they use the African culture. And so what we are doing as CSC is to look at this text and the languages that is offered that the church or Christianity gives to the society at large to discriminate against people who identify as queer. And what we have done as CSC and myself, we've realized that some of these texts and some of these cultures that people are using in that kind of conversation, these need to look into them, because what informs that kind of a thing is more of a Western view. And so when you see and begin to look at African cultures, are African cultures strongly rejecting differences? And you see hospitality as a key thing for every African culture. And so reclaiming this aspect of hospitality within culture, and that African cultures are not repressive and rejecting differences. So that's been one of the key things that we are doing. And also about the Bible, the texts that are used to perpetuate discrimination against queer people are texts that people have not taken time to read deeply and to understand a lot of things within. And many of these texts are only talked about in academic setups. What we've done as CSC and myself is to go to faith leaders at the grassroots level and begin to read these texts together again, doing a Bible study and to understand the things around this particular context from which this text emerged. And what we've realized is that people are knowing new ways and liberating ways of reading this part of scripture, and also beginning to reclaim lots of things within the African culture that talk about hospitality and acceptance of differences within our African context. And so when we talk about Ubuntu in this concept, Ubuntu reminds us of one particular thing, that my humanity is bound up to your humanity. And I am because you are. And so together we exist in that manner. And reclaiming some of these things is the only way that will reduce the dehumanizing things we see that are netted against queer people in Kenya and many parts of Africa. So basically, it's rereading these things again with an African lens of hospitality.
Thank you. So can we go to Kakay?
Yes. I am going to really quickly deviate from my presentation and pick up on what Adera has said. And the first thing that ever came to my mind when you talked about what is your hermeneutics of suspicion. I guess, and this is a personal thing, and we try to kind of facilitate this in how we deal with text, for example. I think we have to arrive at, and be friends with the fact that the text was not written for us per se, in this time and age, and in the particularity of your context. I did not mention this in my presentation, but we were colonized twice over. After we were sold, the United States then came to our country, and this is how we got United Methodist and all the other North American denominations. Beginning in the turn of the century, of the early 1900s, the school that I serve in was one of those first Protestant seminaries that were established. And to answer your question, Professor, may I use the metaphor of the jeepney in the Philippines? There are some of us Filipinos in this call, and please help me in the chat describe what a jeepney is. But a jeepney is our main source of transportation to get us from point A to point B, and it looks like a very it looks like a bus, but it's a jeep, a long jeep. The story around the jeepney is that it was first arrived here as Willie's Jeep, which was a weapon of mass destruction to kill Filipinos during the time of Douglas MacArthur and all that. And so when you think of scripture or religion and Christianity, I think of the Willie's Jeep and how our people turned it into a jeepney. The first thing they did, and this is now I am quoting quoting the method of my teacher, Revelation de Lunta. The first thing they did was to remove the machine gun that was attached to the jeepney, to the jeep, de-weaponize it, extended the seats, and kind of like agreed on how to turn it into public transportation, and that is how the jeepney originated. Text was not written for you. However, in fact, text has been weaponized to hurt you. And so we invoke the imaginations of peoples by turning something that hurts them into something that is life-giving. Very similar to what Adera has just said. We rely on the creativity of the masses to turn something that is a weapon to something that is useful and life-giving. And to add to that, the inventors of Willie's Jeep, with the machine gun and everything, designed to kill the Filipino rebels, did not ever imagine that the Filipinos eventually will turn it into a bus for daily transportation. It's the same with scripture. When it was first written, it was written with a very specific intention, and then it was weaponized against very specific people. It othered and hurt many people, but then communities turn it into something life-giving. I guess that's my simplest answer to your question, Professor. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I wonder if Bishop Tolton, you have another question for the speakers?
Bishop Rawls, do I have time for another question?
Yes, actually you do. I wanted to throw one in as well. And then Mr. Tolton. I was moved by, first of all, I love the sharing that you just did, Kakay, in reference to the repurposing of the thing that was viewed as negative, turning to a positive. My experience has been as a kind of religious activist in the United States has been, ironically, the repurposing of holy text in the ways that it has been used in such hurtful, toxic ways in the lives of us who identify as LGBTQIA. And I was thinking about the feminine manifestations presented in each one of your presentations. Kakay, when you were sharing about the womb, and what was so fascinating was the way that the language literally shows the womb, right? I mean, each one of those critical words you lifted up. And Myles, when you talking about and not running from those feminine manifestations. And then also Adera, when you were talking about this principle of Nia Ubuntu, it had a very feminine feel to, all of it had a very feminine feel. And when I think about this notion of repurposing, what impact do you see as more and more culture is shifting in a way that makes room for feminine manifestations of God? That this notion of hospitality is very feminine in its kind of context. The notion of if you are, then I, we are, I am, we are. All of these things have a very feminine feel to them. In what ways do you feel the world can benefit from the embrace of, and I'm cautiously using this term femininity because even how it's defined is problematic in ways. How do you feel we could benefit from a deeper embrace of what may be defined as feminine manifestations of God? Whichever one may want to answer, and I'll ask that you keep your responses kind of brief because I want to go like a lot of different ways with this, but we don't have much time. And I do want to circle back and let each of my colleagues ask one more question. Thank you.
May I go? Okay. I promise I'll be brief. I can unpack that question like for days, right? I do not. I think what I want to say is not that we can, the best benefit, I guess, the benefit that we can get from surfacing the divine feminine is that it counters the very problematic white male masculine anthropomorphic God who is sitting on a throne somewhere up in the clouds, right? Behind the golden gate. The divine feminine counters this narrative and counters this very weaponized, it has been weaponized against people who are not white, people who are not male, people, younger people, etc., etc. So yeah, that's my short answer. That divine feminine discourse in how in the many ways that it is manifested counters that very, very imperial masculine heterosexist male white narrative of God.
Thank you so much. One thing that I need to point out is before the missionaries came to Africa, the names of God within many cultures is neither male nor female. And in many places you find in our worship spaces, when people identify so much with the divine feminine more than the aspects of fatherhood, the aspect of a male kind of a dominant narrative about God. What this has done, this has created room for everybody to find a place. It's creating room for all of us to keep on experiencing a God who is loving, a God who is caring, a tender God, not just a God up there who is used as yeah. So basically, what the world can learn with this, and what we are saying, all of us can learn, that there's a possibility. God, we cannot confine Godhood to one particular a way of defining things, or the masculine particular way. So the possibility within embracing a divine feminine is more liberating, and it helps to chant down a lot of oppressive system like patriarchy, heteronormativity. It takes us to that level. So it's more liberating. It helps to chant down those systems that have been passed down of patriarchy and heteronormativity.
Thank you. Myles?
Yeah, thank Kakay and Adera both for those reflections. I guess one thing that's coming to the top of mind for me is how embracing the divine feminine alters our relationship with the land we live on. I think that that is one piece of our thinking about God and thinking about the divine that is really pressing, and is really urgent. And I think a lot of the way that, for example, ecological justice or environmental justice often is shaped is through a very like masculinized lens. And it's all about like fixing, and it's all about doing to, and these kinds of things. Whereas I think the divine feminine helps us to really focus on the relational pieces of what it means to be a part of land, to be not only caring for land, but being cared for by land, to understand that we are in community with the earth beneath our feet, and that there is something inherently mutual and or should be reciprocal about how we participate. And I think that that reorders almost all of our relationships if we can think about it that way. And so to me, that sort of thinking and that consciousness is an inherent part of the divine feminine. And so that's another thing that to me is important.
Thank you very much. I want to ask this question because somebody posed it on the chat. That is, given that we have so little media coverage or knowledge about what is happening in grassroots movements outside of the United States. For example, the work that Kakay and also Adera you mentioned, and how can we keep connected with progressive movements and peoples that is not within North Atlantic? What are the ways we can keep learning about what your group or your people are doing?
Me first again. Yes. Okay. Thank you for that question. And there are, in fact, people here from my neck of the woods, my neighbors, who are here from the National Council of Churches in the Philippines and the United Church of Christ in the Philippines, and they are doing a lot of work on the ground for these things at the risk of their own lives. And I'm not even exaggerating. Okay, so if you want to connect with us, with them, if you are in this call, there we also have people from the Metropolitan Community Churches who are also in this call, as well as my colleagues from Union Theological Seminary. We have this very loose kind of partnership with each other where we see each other on the ground while we're doing it. And we kind of like run toward like the same direction if the police are trying to chase us. So there are a lot of programs that we can partner with you with, or educational orientations that you need done if you want to start there. I think the strengths of gatherings like this is to bring people together and make you feel that you're not alone and that someone from the other side of the world is feeling the exact same way as you. And that's a wonderful thing. So I will be putting my contact details here. And I encourage everyone else also from the Philippines and from our region in Southeast Asia, if you are in the call, please try to, connect with the people so we can start working together and, make our voices louder. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think one major way of connecting with us is through this space that has been provided in this kind of a conversation. And so every time there are these kind of conversation, theological conversations, we are willing as CSE to partner just to come and have tell our story. And we also invite people when we are having similar conversations in Kenya, very just to come and join us in this continuing conversation. But also you could partner with us through trainings. One of our key things is to engage grassroots faith leaders, because as much as we are creating a safe space for LGBT people in Kenya, out there, the narrative is still repressive. And so one way of partnering with us is through trainings and basically to faith leaders at grassroots level, because the text and narrative they're using what is used in the task as community to discriminate against LGBT people. And so basically, Bishop Tolton is here on the call, and he's our bishop and overseer for our ministry. We can also connect through him with TFAM and join us in Nairobi. Every time you find a chance to come to Africa, we have a vibrant service for LGBT community, and you could join us in our service every time you come in Africa. We also have our social media handles, which we'll share here. You could join our services every Sunday. You could watch and be our choir, farming choir in a various social media platforms. I will share with Naya to share with us in this platform. Thank you.
Also, I want to encourage people through the chat, if there's somebody that you want to connect with specifically, in the moments that we have left, please, by all means, just inbox them directly, and you can ask whatever you want, and then people can acknowledge, those connections. But that's also part of why we wanted to make sure in the feed loop segment that you also had information about each one of the groups. So by all means, connect with them. Dr. Kwok, I didn't know if you had another question you wanted to ask anyone, and then us going to Bishop Tolton last. You will get the last question, Bishop Tolton, if you do not have anything, Dr. Kwok. Okay, and I think she said she was okay. So Bishop Tolton.
Sure. I want to kind of go back to building on the question Bishop Rawls asked, and Myles actually began to wade into the waters to answer the question. As Kakay said, this vision of the divine feminine rebukes and pushes back against the idea of the autocratic, masculine, militaristic, just ready to kill you at any moment, God. But as it does that, it also then rebukes and pushes back against the autocratic, militaristic leader who governs through the spirit of patriarchy, all kind of cradled by the ideas of dominance. And I would love to hear you both talk a little bit about the ways in which our work is now that our theological explorations and revelations are having real political implications. Again, Myles started to talk about that in terms of an ecofeminism, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about the role of our movements in your respective contexts in the Philippines and in Kenya as it relates to the political terrain and how your work is impacting the political terrain where you are.
Kakay, do you want to go on and jump in first? I know I said I'm not going to be first again, but please, by all means, go for it.
Thank you. I wish I had time to unpack that question. There are LGBT organizing, LGBTQA++ organizing in the Philippines is a little complicated because there are cultural differences. Like, for example, we have bakla as a word for that roughly translates to gay, but isn't exactly gay, right? In English, and so there are nuances and specific experiences in our culture that does not readily translate to the LGBTQIA, which is a language that that we as activists and theologians use. Right? So that we can just simply agree on a language first, and then we can just like unpack that in our own cultures. So organizing is still a challenge in a sense that it's a very complicated terrain, and therefore fighting this whole thing from all fronts has been the way to do it, right? On all sides, from all sides. We do it on the legislation policy level, intersectional solidarity work among farmers, that when I described earlier about the farmers who came to Pride March with us, who learned about the LGBTQI for the first time by being in the Pride March, and then seeing the similarities of the struggle of the LGBT persons in their own struggle for land and justice. These are, how do I say, sadly in the Philippines, yet there is no consolidated, solid LGBTQIA movement to like push all the agenda forward. In the theological world, in the field of theology, there are only a handful of us who do very clearly queer and feminist theologies, and even that is still, it's a challenge for us to find platforms, for us to find opportunities to teach, for example, in the school systems in the Philippines, because largely we are still a very kind of like backward conservative country. And sometimes many of the, like for instance, the use of pronouns, it doesn't necessarily land immediately in our context because we do not have gendered pronouns in our local tongue. We do not have he and she. We only have one word for it, and it's called siya, you. So these are the complications, well, not opportunities, in fact, for communication and opportunities to make our efforts fuller and more well in tune with each other. Yeah, so yeah, they are opportunities, I believe so. Yes, that's my answer. Thank you.